As you heard earlier today from our Vice Dean, that Edmonton has the largest number of people of Ukrainian descent of any urban complex in Canada. It's always, we wait for the statistics to see where Toronto will be and where Edmonton will be, but Edmonton comes out first on that. And I would like to also say that now Edmonton has its own general consulate, and I'd like to ask our counsel, Mr. Danileko, if he would say a few words. He's been able to join us now.
Thank you very much, and it's my real pleasure to be here at this conference, and it's very important that on the eve of commemorating the victims of Holodomor, we are trying to spread this information as wide as possible to give the world the real picture of that tragedy, of the scale of the tragedy which happened in Ukraine in 1932-33. And I would like to thank you, organizers of this conference, for holding this conference. As I told you, it's very important for us and for all the people to remember and to not to allow this tragedy happen ever again in the world. And I just would like to inform you that I just returned from the British Columbia a couple days ago, and on Tuesday, the Parliament, the Legislative Assembly of British Columbia, adopted the act on recognizing the Holodomor as an act of genocide in Ukraine, and proclaiming the Remembrance Day of the fourth Saturday of November. So this is also a very important event, and for us, because we try to make that more and more people in the world, more and more countries, more and more provinces in one country know about this. And if you have such a kind of legislation, at the first step, then we can, based on that legislation, introduce appropriate programs in schools, in universities. So it's very important. And already it was already been said that we just opened the consulate here last year, and I'm very proud to be here and to represent Ukraine, officially represent Ukraine in this great city of Edmonton, in the great province of Alberta, and we cover not only Alberta but also Saskatchewan, British Columbia, Northwest Territories, Yukon. So the half of the Canada, it's under our responsibility. And having such an active and vibrant community, Ukrainian community here in Western Canada, it's very, we are honored, and it's very important and very important task for us to represent Ukraine here. So thank you very much again for introducing me. Thank you very much for organizing again this conference. It's very important, and we are open for cooperation, and any aspect of your activity we would like to help you, to assist in that way we could do it. Thank you very much.
Dear colleagues, honorable guests, I'm Volodymyr Kravchenko, professor at the Department of History and Classics, University of Alberta. I'm also director of the Contemporary Ukrainian Studies of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. I'm chairing this session, which is designed to explore diplomatic sources of the Ukrainian famine. Before I invite our participants to present their papers, I'd like to share with you some ideas about the issue. I'm not a specialist in this field. I'm dealing mostly with historians and their texts, rather than with the objects of their research, or, so to say, social reality. Hence, my approach to the issue of Holodomor is somewhat different. I explore it within the framework of Ukrainian modern nation-state building as reflected in historical writing. From such a perspective, the thin red line, which, as many of us believe, should divide history as an academic enterprise, and the policy of identity is getting almost invisible when it comes to the cases, to the issues like Holodomor or, let me say, the Ukrainian-Russian relations. They have pronounced political, national, and ethical dimensions. At the same time, they demonstrate the limits of history as a discipline. Recently, many people in Ukraine were a little bit scandalized with the public polemic started by the Ukrainian ambassador to Germany, Mr. Melnik, about the Ukrainian-German Commission of Historians and its role in interpretation and representation of Holodomor. I am not well informed about the Commission's accomplishments, but obviously the polemics once again raised the issue of academic freedom and the role of history in the policy of identity, this time at the international level. Perhaps our General Counsel will be more satisfied with our modest accomplishments here and today. With regard to the session, one of the questions is how well were the Western observers informed about what was going on in Ukraine and in the Soviet Union in general? I believe that we are not completely ignorant or deceived. Just one example, William Chamberlain, a journalist and respected historian, who was correspondent of the Daily Christian Science Monitor and Manchester Guardian in the Soviet Union, tried to provide truthful reporting about the man-made famine in Ukraine in 1933, contrary to his colleague, already mentioned, Walter Duranty, whose deceitful reports brought him the Pulitzer Prize, while Chamberlain was under fierce attack by the pro-Soviet and pro-communist elements. I believe that at least some of the Western diplomats were well informed about the fact of the famine. The question is why they presented it in that particular way, and what did they do with this knowledge? Again, history can answer only some of these questions. Perhaps psychology is better equipped for the task. Now let me introduce our first presenter, Dr. Hiroaki Kuromiya, professor of history at Indiana University and a member of the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton University. He is the author of several books: Stalin, Profile in Power, Conscience on Trial, The Fate of 14 Pacifists in Stalin's Ukraine, The Voices of the Dead, Stalin's Great Terror in the 30s, and Freedom and Terror in the Donbass, a Ukrainian-Russian borderland, which is my favorite. Dr. Kuromiya, please take the floor.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Now, he mentioned the Western perspective, but I'm going to discuss the Eastern perspective. In my case, from the Japanese perspective, I would like to discuss the Holodomor by looking at the Japanese sources and reports and see what we can learn from them. Now, Japan was one of the few nations that had diplomatic missions in Soviet Ukraine, along with Poland, Germany, Greece, Turkey, and later Czechoslovakia. So it would be nice to have a representation from Turkey and Greece, but at least we have some from Poland and Germany. Now, Japan had founded its first consulate in Odessa in 1902. Of course, Japan was in view of a possible war with the Russian Empire, which actually took place in 1904, 1905, and they watched the movement of Black Fleet through the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. So it has strategic importance. Of course, during the war, it disappeared. It was abolished and then later resumed. And in 1925, when Japan and the Soviet Union resumed diplomatic relations, it created a new consulate in Odessa, which, like many other foreign consulates, were abolished in 1937-38 at the time of the Great Terror. Now, we do know that Japan collected enormous amount of information on Ukraine, not just on the Soviet Union. This of course, had to do with strategic concerns. From Polish archives, we do know that, yes, there was a great deal of interaction between Poland and Japan, exchanging information, intelligence on the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, Japan was defeated in the war, and in that process, many documents were destroyed, or they burned them. So it's a great pity that we don't have as many as we would like to. But there are a few which, as I'm going to discuss, are extremely revealing. So I'd like to say a few words about Japanese documents and reports. I have said at the beginning that these documents and reports do not change our sort of general picture of the famine. They are very illuminating reports, but nothing will change what we already know. There are details, of course, and there are some very interesting details, but the general picture will not be changed by these documents. However, they do reveal how Japan understood the famine, understood the Soviet Union, why the famine took place, and what is the significance of the famine, and so on. So I'd like to say a few words about this. Now, why was Japan interested in Ukraine? Actually, it was greatly interested in Ukraine. Of course, Japan is a neighbor of the Soviet Union. Ukraine is very far, some 8,000 kilometers away from Japan. Nevertheless, Japan was interested in Ukraine as a potential subversive force against Russia's domination of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. So it studied it, and it tried to mobilize Ukrainians, particularly Ukrainian diasporas in the West and Ukrainian diasporas in the East, in Manchuria, in China, and Russia's maritime province, which had a great number of ethnic Ukrainians. And that project was called the Zeleny Green, which they tried to mobilize these Ukrainians as a potential subversive force against Soviet power. So it did observe Ukrainian scenes very carefully. The only outpost was Odessa, but the Japanese exchanged a great deal of intelligence information with Poland. I haven't found much information with collaboration with Germany yet, but as I said, so many documents were burned and destroyed, we don't know the full extent of Japan's involvement in Ukraine. But there is one very interesting report by the Polish diplomat that when in the autumn of 1934, the Soviet Army, Red Army, had military maneuver in Ukraine, and the Polish diplomat reported to Warsaw that this was a demonstration against Japan, which is a bit incredible, but that is the extent of Moscow's fear of Japan's involvement in Ukrainian affairs. Now, also, as I mentioned in my question to I forgot your name, Paolo. The question of the Soviet-Polish non-aggression pact is extremely important, because when this was ratified, many Ukrainians gave up on Poland as a potential source of support. So they turned to Japan for support, and we have a great deal of documents about it. Not much came out of it. Nevertheless, Ukrainians are looking for a potential support, and Japan was a particularly important power they sought to rely on. Also, the East becomes terribly important, because once these non-aggression pact with Poland, Estonia, Finland Stalin clearly believed that the West was relatively safe. So Moscow diverted a great deal of resources to the east. Great deal of resources to the east. East was more important. And in Mongolian People's Republic, for example, 1/3 of the country was rebelling against Mongolian authorities, which were carrying out forced Sovietization of the country. 1/3. Incredible. It's almost a civil war, and Soviet intelligence, Soviet military forces were intervening in Mongolia precisely at the time when the famine was taking place in Ukraine. So without looking at the East, sometimes it's difficult to understand the West. In this sense, I think what Japan was doing in the East is important. When we look at the Japanese sources, yes, even though so much was destroyed, there is still a great deal. And they are terribly important, very interesting. I mentioned some of these reports Japanese diplomats wrote and sent to Tokyo. Very interesting, very detailed, and often very accurate. However, mentioning of famine is relatively rare. And I wonder why this is. Most likely, the information was censored. Why? It's all related to what Paolo said, Germany's reluctance. Poland was reluctant because of the non-aggression pact and did not want to complicate relations with Moscow. Washington, I think my successor will discuss this. FDR didn't want to mention it because FDR was secretly trying to restore diplomatic relations. So he relied on Walter Duranty and others. So Ukrainian famine was not really mentioned was not interesting to the present aspiring president FDR and so on. So all these political considerations affected the way Ukrainian Holodomor was propagated or not propagated by important world powers. What we have is certainly very interesting because Japan's mission was placed only in Odessa. The coverage was rather limited. The coverage of countryside was rather limited, but the coverage of the city was relatively comprehensive and very interesting. In March 1932, for example, it described food shortages and food shortage in the city, and one report says at one factory, thousands of hungry workers stormed the canteen, causing injuries among them. So hungry workers wanted to eat. On December 1932, the consul wrote to Tokyo that the food situation is awful, terrible. It is worse than it was at the time of the Great Famine in 1921-22. So the extent of the suffering seems to be clear. And a week later, he wrote that the situation became deteriorated. There are also 300 pages survey of Ukrainian national economy in 1932, early 1933. Their secretary of the consulate concluded that Ukraine's agricultural sector was a big failure. But unfortunately, he doesn't mention the famine. Why? It's impossible that he didn't know. Most likely, somehow, someone censored it. Why? I meant to say a little more later, but maybe I should say so here. Japan had invaded Manchuria, created the Manchu War in the spring of 1932, and they wanted to consolidate their hold of Manchuria. If the Soviet Union intervenes in Manchuria, then it will be a disaster. So Japan had every reason not to provoke the Soviet Union into interfering in their affairs, Japanese affairs in Manchuria. So there was every reason for Tokyo not to provoke the Soviet Union, or not to alienate the Soviet Union from what Japan was doing. So there was some kind of implicit sort of agreement in Tokyo that, well, let's not make a big deal of this, even in internal documents, which is quite surprising. There are some very interesting details. In May 1933, there was a report that typhus is endemic there. Hospitals were full. Elementary schools were closed temporarily because they were needed to house sick people. Normally, Children's March for May Day takes place on the day before, April the 30th, but that year was cancelled. Streetcars, trams were being disinfected because they were afraid of sick people spreading the disease. It also says that rationing was raised for May Day so that people could participate in the May Day parade. But then, shortly later, after May Day parade, the situation hasn't improved at all. If anything, it even deteriorated. The most graphic report written by Japanese consul is about cannibalism. I don't know whether he actually witnessed it, probably no, but clearly there was a great deal of rumor about it, and he just conveyed what he heard to Moscow. In one striking case, he says, quote, in late July, this is 1933, in late July, a land surveyor was sent to Novokrainka, a village in Odessa Oblast, with the worst agricultural record, probably delivery of grain to the authorities. He was attacked and eaten by the peasants. Therefore, the district head of agriculture had to request a successor from Odessa. Well, I don't know whether this is true or not, but there was such rumor. There was a sort of extreme tension between peasants and the authorities. Some other similar reports on these graphic description of the famine. If we look at published or semi-published, it's not clear whether actually published, maybe internal reports, there is a clear indication that they understood the ethnic dimension of the Holodomor. This is anti-Ukrainian measure taken by Moscow because Moscow was afraid of potential Ukrainian nationalism. There are some striking figures as well. Even a pamphlet written by Good Neighbors Society, in other words, a society that tried to promote a good relationship with Japan's neighbor, namely the Soviet Union, said that in Ukraine every cat and dog had been eaten, and they estimated that 10 million people died of the famine. Probably that figure, as we know today, was exaggerated, not correct. Nevertheless, they somehow came to that conclusion. We don't know where they got the information. I have cited many other cases, but time is limited, so I'd like to go on to discuss the importance of Japan's understanding of the Soviet system by way of discussing Ukraine's Holodomor. The most striking thing about Japanese analysis of the Holodomor is that no surprise. It's not surprising at all. Why was it not surprising to them? Because the Japanese thought this is the logical conclusion of Stalin's policy. Squeeze a nation for the sake of national defense, for the sake of war. Many people, including some Japanese, and they also criticized foreign observers, that, the famine, this signifies the failure of Stalin's policy, failure of Stalin's grip over power in the Soviet Union. But most of the observers appeared to have understood differently. This is actually Stalin's success. Without causing a real threat to his hold on power, Stalin managed to squeeze so many resources from the country, from the peasants, and promoted the 5-year plan, strengthened the Red Army. This is dreadful. Nevertheless, this was Stalin's success. And there are many reports about how terrible people were living in the Soviet Union at that time. They simply couldn't believe the way the government was treating the ordinary people. One military general who traveled from Tokyo to Europe by way of Trans-Siberian Railway, he saw children and women, and he said, this is a military man, he said he could not help crying for them because they are living with their clothes, their hunger. They are so terrible that he could not help crying over their situation. They believe that no other country can do this kind of thing to their citizens. But the Soviet Union is doing, Stalin is doing, and apparently they probably couldn't see the details of what was happening in Ukraine. Nevertheless, people seem to be accepting their fate imposed by Moscow. So here, their conclusion is very interesting. Of course, Japan was in a potentially hostile relation with the Soviet Union. Now, the country can do this country, the Soviet Union, can do this kind of thing to strengthen its military forces. How can we fight a war against this kind of country? We cannot do this to our citizens, even though Japan was not particularly rich and some people were hungry. But look at the Soviet Union. With their dictatorial power, they do this to their citizens, and citizens seem to be accepting it. We cannot antagonize, we cannot fight war against this. So there was a great deal of fright, very evident in the reports and the documents they wrote to Tokyo. Karl Radek, who is an incredibly interesting man, he said, look at Stalin. This is the time of the famine. Stalin's nerves were like wire ropes in the face of the famine. Radek also told Ukrainian, Polish, I think he was a journalist, Medziński. Radek said, when Medziński asked Radek about famine in Ukraine, he said, so what? Even if the Poles were right that the famine existed in the Soviet Ukraine, and even if 1 million people had died in Ukraine, it just meant that the Soviet population would be 178 million instead of 180. He said 2 million. what kind of response? Radek. Chicherin, by the way, in the early 1920s, said similar things to the Germans. Of course, millions of people died. More people die in China. But I think our policy is right. So this is what Bolsheviks believed in. Even people like Chicherin, who was quite critical of Stalin's foreign policy in the 1920s, and he died in disgrace, fearing being poisoned by Stalin. This is so. In a sense, it seems to me many Japanese observers understood the essence of Soviet policy, Soviet government. What Stalin did was a success for him. They also came to a similar conclusion at the time of the Great Terror, when Stalin was killing off his military high command. Many Germans, if not all the Germans, believed, Stalin destroyed his own military forces, now we can beat the Soviet Union. But many Japanese military specialists, including military attachés in Moscow, concluded otherwise. This is a way of Stalin's consolidating his power. These old guards were gone, they were killed, but Stalin is fostering a new political military cadre, loyal to Stalin and competent in military affairs. In other words, this is a country which to fight is extremely difficult. This is a frightening country. That was the Japanese experts' opinion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kuromiya. Our next presenter is Dr. Andrii Bolianovskyi. He is a senior research associate at the Kravchenko Institute for Ukrainian Studies of the National Academy of Sciences based in Lviv. He is the author of the books on the Nazi politics in Galicia, its western Ukrainian region, and the Ukrainian military units of the German armed forces in 1939-1945, all published in Ukrainian. He is co-authoring with Bohdan Klid a forthcoming study, Collectivization and Holodomor in U.S. State Department documents. Dr. Bolianovskyi, please.
Thank you for the possibility to introduce my project. While many countries maintained diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union after 1922, the United States of America did not. The United States established diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union only in November 1933, but its Department of State, headed by Henry Simpson from 1929 to early 1933, and later by his successor Cordell Hull, regularly collected information about the Soviet Union, mainly from tourists, specialists, and other American citizens who had traveled to the Soviet Union, including those invited by its government and who remained there in the early 1913s. Some of them, during this return home, made visits to United States diplomatic missions in European countries bordering the Soviet Union, especially in Poland and Latvia. American diplomats wrote reports about their meetings with Ukrainians, describing what they heard and their impressions of what they saw in the Soviet Union. United States diplomats also collected information about the Soviet Union that was available in other countries, and some of them wrote analytical notes based on information they believed to be worthy of reporting to Washington. These documents have never been fully studied. James Mace was the first researcher who collected archival documents from the United States Department of State materials during his work for the United States Congress Commission on the Ukraine famine. The American historian Wayne Morris also worked with State Department documents in his book Stalin's Famine and Russia Recognized United States recognize of Russia, focusing primarily on United States policy as to the Soviet Union and the circumstances of its recognition by Franklin Delano Roosevelt government. In a separate section, he documented the allegation that the United States Department was well informed on the famine. Despite some work being done, the study of the subject of collectivization and the Holodomor in the documents of the United States State Department for the years of 1929 and 1933 still remains a little researched problem. In February 1918, the United States broke off diplomatic relations with Bolshevik Russia, but the United States Department never ceased to be interested in the events in Russia, Ukraine, and other republics that formed after the collapse of the Russian Empire. Ever since the creation of the Soviet Union, the Department of Eastern European Affairs of the United States Department of State studied the situation in these lands. Initially, all information about Ukraine and other Eastern European countries was received by this department and then depended on the decision of its management about its importance or conversely its inferiority. It was reported to the Secretary of State or kept in the archive of the department. The United States Department of State was well aware of the famine in the Ukrainian lands of 1921, 1922-23, immediately after its inception. At that time, the Soviet Union leadership, under pressure from the domestic political and economical crisis in that country, and in order to solve socio-economic problems, acknowledged the fact of famine and agreed to accept assistance for hungry population. Some United States charities responded to the Kremlin's calls for help. The American Relief Administration and the American Mennonite Assistance to Famine in Ukraine, with branches in Kyiv, Zaporizhzhia, Kharkiv, Odessa, and other Ukrainian cities, in particular provided assistance to certain categories of starving people. The era, headed by Herbert Hoover, Secretary of Commerce in the government of the President of the United States, Warren Harding, in the midst of its activities in the summer of 1922, provided food for 10 million people in the Russian Socialist Federal Soviet Republic and another 2 million in Ukraine, and provided them with medical supplies and clothing. The Soviet authorities requested the West to send aid to Russia, but interfered with its delivery to Ukraine, at least initially. Also in August 1921, the West knew from Soviet sources about the catastrophic conditions in Ukraine. Representatives of the Soviet Union either denied that the country was starving or downplayed its scale. Moscow initially insisted that all assistance should go to the Volga region and assured the West that Ukraine could take care of itself and could even help Russia. Western countries preferred to ignore the humanitarian catastrophe in Ukraine, even though they knew that millions were starving. The situation improved at the end of that year, particularly thanks to the lobbying of the American Jewish community. American Jewish Committee joined pressured ERA to set up distribution centers in Ukraine to ship products to their friends and relatives who lived there. In the wake of news from Ukrainian Jewry, Joint also advocated that ERA should investigate the famine situation in Ukraine. ERA was able to persuade the Soviet Union to allow its delegation to visit Ukraine in December 1921. The result was a Hutchinson-Gold agreement and a separate agreement signed Buareb and the government of the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic, which led to the expansion United States assistance to Ukraine. The activities of the era in the Ukrainian lands were closely monitored by the staff of the Soviet state political administration of Ukraine, whose messengers recorded details of provision of this assistance. One of them, in September of 1923, for example, mentioned the fact that free dining rooms were created in Ukraine, where posters were often hung with content like this: the food provided in this canteen and of the American aid administration is a voluntary gift of the American people for children of Ukraine. However, since the main subject of my study is the subject of the preconditions, circumstances and consequences of collectivization and the Holodomor in Ukraine in 1934, it's important to focus on these issues on the first place, since the study and characterization of early 1920s events in Ukraine in the light of American documents deserve separate attention. All information about collectivization and Holodomor in Ukraine and the famine in other republics of the Soviet Union were personally studied by Robert Kelly, head of the Eastern European Affairs Division of the United States Department of States. Many chief officials of the United States State Department in Europe were also well informed about this tragic events. This included the following high-ranking United States diplomats with long-standing experience. Also, there were Philander L. Cabell, former United States charge d'affaires in Cuba, Havana, and later Buenos Aires, first secretary of the United States Embassy in Warsaw, first secretary of the United States legation in Warsaw in 1932-1935. His successor, Sheldon Leavitt Crosby, as secretary of the United States Embassy in Warsaw. Jerome Clender Huddle, American Consul General in Warsaw. John C. Wheely chaired affairs at interim United States Embassy in Warsaw. Ernst Lloyd Harris, United States Consul General in Vienna in 1929-1935. John Work Garrett, United States Ambassador to Italy, 1929-1933. Frederick Mosley Sackett, United States Ambassador to Germany, 1930-1933. George Strausser Messerschmitt, United States Consul General in Berlin in 1930-1934. Raymond Hermann Geist, first Secretary of the United States Embassy in Germany from 1929 to 1939. Frederick Coleman, head of the United States Embassy in Latvia. Apart from them, many other members and diplomatic staff of the United States embassies and consulates in these countries, as well as in Lithuania, Estonia, and other countries, were informed about man-made famine organized by the Soviet Union in Ukraine. The first informative reports by the American diplomat to the United States Department about Bolshevik politics of collectivization that caused mass deaths of Ukrainians are dated by 1939-1913. These are largely documents from that many translated articles of official newspapers of Communist Party that were published and included mainly official information that may be not so worthy, but just the source of information for us. But from time to time, it was more and more important information in these reports. For example, on December 29, 1929, the American consulate in Tallinn did send a letter to Frederick Coleman entitled Conditions in Soviet Russia, November 1929. The main attention there was devoted to the Agrarian Crisis, which was described as follows. In the country districts, the reign of terror still continues. From every side, reports are received concerning the execution of so and so many people. Nervousness is felt in all quarters. On the other hand, it is of interest to state that it is officially recognized to a certain extent that there exists a Gulag terror which is directed against the Soviet system. Special attention was devoted to Ukraine in a paragraph entitled "The Separatist Movement in the Ukraine." The situation in Ukraine was concerned in a direct way with the struggle of Ukrainians for independence. It was stated in particular in the report admitted by the consulate covering conditions in Soviet Russia during October 1929, mention was made of indication of a decided separatist movement in the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. Events which took place during November 1929, to which prominence was given in the European press, revealed the existence of an important organization in the Ukraine, which had for their purpose the establishment of the independence of the Ukrainian Republic. It was ascertained that this organization stood in close touch with Ukrainian circles in Poland and with the Polish government itself. To my mind, this probably means, first of all, contacts between maybe just in imagine or I don't know, the contacts between maybe Ukrainians in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic and maybe in Ukrainian community in Western Ukraine. But this in document it will state there have always been separatist tendencies in the Ukraine, but hitherto they have been scattered and unorganized. The movement which the Soviet government now claims to have uncovered appears to have been very extensive in nature and fairly well developed. At the same time, the United States Department of State also received some notes with a concise and detailed overview of certain aspects of the national, economic, and social policies of the Bolsheviks in Ukraine. The subject matters varied from brief references to the collapse of Ukrainization and the fabricated case concerning the union of the liberation of Ukraine, Союз визволення України, in 1930, and ending with a note on Ukrainian economic affairs based on information obtained from a report of the General Consulate of Poland in Kharkiv dated by April 8, 1930. A very interesting report, stamped strictly confidential, on the subject of collectivization and deportation of Ukrainian peasants so far away in inhospitable places in Russia, and is dated by March 20, 1930. These documents allege the Soviet Russia leadership was insisting a policy of destroying the national farms in Ukraine through mass expulsions of better off Ukrainian farmers to Siberia. In a note, its author Philander Cable, Secretary of the United States Embassy in Warsaw, informed the United States Secretary of State in Washington that information had recently been realized, which have appeared in the press throughout the world during the past months to the offset that there will be a wholesale transfer of Ukrainian peasants, principally those who were formerly successful farmers, from their country, albeit to other parts of the Soviet Union. The author of this note states that according to some sources, 900,000 Ukrainians will be moved during the 5-year plan, and that during 1930 approximately 6,000 Ukrainians will be sent to Kazakhstan, Don district, 54,000 to the far east, and 30,000 to Siberia. The author of the note wrote that it is argued that such notion is contemplated not only with the view of placing good farmers in cultivated districts, but also with the purpose of breaking down the racial solidarity that exists in Soviet Ukraine. Beginning with in 1931, the United States diplomats also began to report to the State Department on insufficient gun supplies in both rural areas and cities of Ukraine. On April 24, 1931, Frederick Coleman, head of the United States Embassy in Latvia, reported this in a letter to the United States Secretary of State, a copy of which was sent to the United States Embassy in Paris. Referring to the content of these letters from Kharkiv, Kyiv, and Pryatyn, published in one of the Russian emigrant newspapers, he stated that the addresses who received food parcels from abroad were each with a maximum weight of 10 kilogram, including smelt, butter, and pig fat. The author of this letter stated that there are no such products in Ukraine in Kharkiv. However, given the censorship prevailing in the Soviet Union, the author Coleman made the assumption that this should in fact mean that we have no food supply at all in Kharkiv, whatever this may mean. From 1932, Washington also received reports that revealed how Bolshevik policy was causing a man-made famine in Ukraine. For example, on March 13, 1932, the United States delegation in Latvia sent a note to the State Department containing information obtained from Tikhon Klinovich and his wife, both United States citizens, who arrived in Riga after a week-long trip to Ukraine. In the note called Grain Rights on the Villages, it was mentioned that in cases where the peasant did not meet their grain delivery targets, police detachments would come and accompany the trucks into some villages. There is a complete search that would be made and hidden ahead and bread sized. Large quantities were sometimes obtained. After information that the grain was taken directly to the railways to fill wagons, it was mentioned that the local authorities allocated a part of the harvest to the local security officers, who forcibly removed the grain from the peasants and their families. The troops were also summoned to Kherson and Odessa on several occasions for the OGPU. Describing living conditions in the villages where Tikhon Klinovich had lived, the author mentioned the insufficient supply to the village and stated, among other things, the cooperative had a very limited supply of food. The monthly diet was 50 grams. In November and December, the meat was sold only 3 times in the cooperatives. Eggs cost 7 rubles for a dozen. An interesting observation of the author of the note was the mention of a village bordering the village in which Tikhon Klinovich temporarily lived. It was a settlement where all the population died out completely, but in order to conceal this fact and in view of the complex sanitary condition in the village, it was declared quarantined as a zone of epidemiological disease with a categorical entry ban to it, so that no one could go there to witness this death by hunger. The United States government did not consider it necessary to respond formally to such information. State Department staff adhered to the policy of non-interference in the internal affairs of other states. The United States, while not maintaining diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union at that time, wanted to establish diplomatic relations with the USSR after the election of new President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and considered it necessary to deepen economical relations and trade with this country. At the same time, for Stalin, the United States could be an important source of technology for industrialization. In pursuing a policy of strengthening industry, including, of course, military-related industry, the Soviet Union was interested in increasing foreign exchange operations to obtain funds for payment of patents, the work of foreign specialists, the purchase of equipment abroad in order to transform the Soviet Union from a predominantly undeveloped agrarian country into a developed industrial one. However, in the face of the global economical crisis, prices for grain fell under these conditions. Stalin ordered the People's Commissariat of the People's Economy, the People's Commissariat of Foreign Trade, and the People's Commissariat of Supply of the Soviet Union, together with Export Klid, to increase the scales of foreign grain exports at lower prices. On December 29, 1931, at a meeting of the Currency Commission of the Council of People's Commissariat SARS of the Soviet Union, it was decided to obtain new quotas for export of grain, food, and other food products and industrial raw materials to the West in the first quarter of 1932. At the same time, when millions of people were dying in Ukraine due to lack of food, the Communist International Commentator was allocating millions of dollars from grain export from Ukraine to prepare the so-called World Proletarian Revolution. The United States Department was well aware of this. In one of the notes to the United States Department dated November 4, 1932, it was stated, the financial budget of the 20th plenary session of the Executive Committee of the Communist International held in Moscow in September 1932 testifies that $736,000 for the purpose of communist propaganda and preparatory activities to the Soviet intervention was interpreted as subsidies to party newspapers, printing and cultural and educational work. Most information about the famine of 1932-1933 in Ukraine, which came to the United States Department, came in the period from spring to the end of 1933. On April 4th, 1933, for example, Sheldon Levitt Crosby, Secretary of the United States Embassy in Warsaw, devoted attention to Ukrainian resistance in a letter citing confidential message on March 10 of that year. He sent a special message to the Secretary of State in Washington, quoting from various sources in February of that year. Citing an extract of one of the Ukrainian newspapers, he states that through the Bolshevik press to see that passive resistance as well as sabotage occurs in 3 quarters of Ukraine, North Caucasus and the Crimean Republic, or in other districts with a minority population. The note states that during a meeting of the sessions of the Central Committee of Communist Party of Belarus, the first secretary of this party, Holodomor, admitted that White Russia follows the example of the Ukraine in conducting a serious struggle against Moscow. However, in fact, the head of the Belarusian Bolsheviks most likely insisted the geographical names Belarus and Ukraine apparently used the terms Belarusian counter-revolution and Ukrainian counter-revolution, more familiar to the Bolshevik language in this context. I have no time, yes? Sorry. No, the problem is that I must to say that documents of the United States Department on collectivization in Holodomor, it's too much information because it's about it's a microfilm T2049. It's included about 10 rolls, each about over 1,000 frames, or even 1,050 frames. And to describe or to analyze, it's very. I will make conclusion. Okay. In fact, presented and quotes from United States Department of State archival documents and separate publications show that the State Department was certainly well informed about the effect of Great Famine in Ukraine. The President of the United States, members of the government and members of its Congress also knew about it. But like the government and authorities of other countries, they did not consider it necessary to make the necessary effort to save millions of peoples who were under Stalin's tyranny from death by starvation. And in perspective, to my mind, much more attention of scholars is needed to bring to light documents containing information about collectivization, about so-called liquidation of Kulak as class and the Great Famine in Ukraine, the Kuban and other areas of the former Soviet Union. Particular attention can be paid to determine what was known about the causes, progress, scale and consequence of collectivization and Holodomor by the United States Department of State officials and other American officials. Equally important are the documents on related issues such as Soviet national policy, repressions of the GPU or Soviet security police and living condition in Ukraine at that time. Thank you for attention.
Thank you very much. Our commentator, Dr. Bohdan Klid, is well known in the field. He is the research director of HREC and former long-time assistant director for research at KIUS. He is the co-editor with Dr. Alexander Motyl of the Holodomor Reader and the editor of the English edition of Stanislav Kulczycki's book on the Holodomor in Ukraine. He is currently preparing for publication a collection of materials on the Holodomor and Stalin-era policy of repressions. Dr. Klid, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to, I think, focus attention first on the question of geopolitics. And the reason I want to do that is because I think we have a lot of papers here where the primacy of geopolitics is evident and where we see that the geopolitical interests certainly outweigh any considerations for governments who knew about the Holodomor to intervene or to make any kind of statements or to raise the issue at all. So this is evident in the French case and the German case to some degree. Anyway, geopolitics plays at least some role, and this conference, I think, has made that clear. And in this particular panel, we also see that this is the case. In the paper by Hiroaki Kuromiya, he emphasizes this, the question of geopolitics, and in Andrii Bolianovskyi hasn't discussed it, so I will a little bit, the United States and geopolitics, because in this panel we have someone speaking about Japan and someone speaking about the US, and it concerns events in the Soviet Union. And of course, if we move forward to World War II, we see that Japan and the United States are at war, and the Soviet Union becomes an ally of the United States and enters the war against Japan in the final days. When it comes to the recognition of the United States of the Soviet Union, certainly the question of the American diplomats are abide by the principle that one should not interfere in the internal affairs of other states because we don't want other states interfering in our affairs. And I think that this principle was recognized internationally more or less by all countries, or the diplomats of all countries. So that's already one strike against any state making any sort of a reference to a famine in another state. Of course, we have to go back in time and we realize that, you know, in the 1930s there was no genocide convention, there was no, human rights were not recognized, so there were no international treaties that bound, that would bind the various governments like they do today. And even today we see that, you know, human rights are ignored, or problems of human rights are ignored in other states. So I think for context, that gives the whole issue of geopolitics even more weight. And in the case of the United States, the recognition came in November 1933, and a factor in the recognition was geopolitics. And the United States was a mature global power. Japan was a power that was also exerting its influence and expanding its territory under its direct control at this time. The United States had a large fleet in the Pacific and had interests in East Asia. So these interests were colliding to some extent with Japan. And the Soviet Union, of course, had its interests in the East because it was not only a European power, but it was an Asian power or Eurasian power. So in the discussions leading up to recognition, Roosevelt did apparently raise the issue of some kind of an agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union aimed against Japan. So I haven't read that much about this, but you know, I think that this is a factor that would be of great importance in Roosevelt's thinking. So now getting back to the papers specifically, I'd like to, I think, make a comment on about the brutality of Soviet officials and their and how the Japanese saw that, and so the conclusion of from what I understand of the Japanese diplomats or observers are that because the people are treated so brutally and the authorities are getting away with it, this would mean that Japan would not want to get into a conflict with the Soviet Union. In the British documents, there's an opposite sort of view on that. And the person who states it is Walter Duranty. In a visit that he makes to, I forget where it is, but one of the British diplomatic posts in Europe, Duranty states that if war were to occur, the peasants will not fight. within the next 5 years because they've been so brutally treated. And I think Duranty was right because when World War II breaks out, we see that large units of the Soviet army don't fight, and I think part of it has to do to the fact that the army is largely a peasant army, and they have gone through collectivization, the Holodomor, and they are not eager to fight for Stalin when Germany attacks. So in this case, I think that the Japanese experts were quite wrong. As far as the another comment, well, the comment referred to by Radek that 2 million peasants died, and so what, right? If we look at other documents and specifically memoirs, we see that we see similar comments made by others. For instance, Kravchenko in his memoir refers to Khatayevich.
Not Kravchenko.
Not me.
No.
Not
Victor
yeah.
Victor Kravchenko's memoir, where he,
Freedom.
yeah, I chose freedom. He writes about a meeting he had, a brief meeting he had with Khatayevich, and Khatayevich said, "We've just had completed a victorious war against the peasantry, and millions died, but the collective farm system has been imposed and is here to stay." An American, Fred Beale, who visited with Petrovsky, mentioned the famine to him. And this was in 1933. And Petrovsky told him, I've written down what Petrovsky said, something to the effect that, yes, millions have died, but the future of the glorious Soviet Union is preserved. So this was, I think, a quite common sort of view of the Soviet officials, and I think it supports the view that there was intent to destroy whatever opposition existed to collectivization, whatever opposition existed to Soviet authority, and as long as the aims of the party were achieved. And I think I've taken up enough time right now. I'll be glad to
1 minute, please.
One minute more? Okay. If I have 1 minute more, then something that wasn't brought up, it was brought up in Andrii Bolianovsky's paper. Maybe what I'll do is maybe pose a couple of questions to our guests. Now, you didn't, this is to Andrii Bolianovsky, a question. You didn't get a chance to speak about this, but Ukrainian, or since we heard this in other papers, Ukrainian organizations in the United States did intervene and try to...
I have no time to...
I know, but the question is, I've seen some of these documents, but perhaps you may have seen more documents that I have, or maybe seen some other documents. Did the Ukrainian organizations make efforts to reach out to, let's say, other groups outside of the Ukrainian community? And the reason I raise this because in the lead up to the recognition, Roosevelt did meet with a Catholic representative because he was afraid of the Catholic vote being, the Catholics were opposed to the to the recognition of the Soviet Union. And so Roosevelt actually asked the diplomats to put in a condition for recognition that religious freedom be observed in the Soviet Union. The diplomats told him, you can't do that because that's interference in the internal affairs of another country. But Roosevelt still insisted that there be something there concerning religion, so he changed that condition for recognition to freedom of religion for Americans in the Soviet Union, which was rather just a sop. In any case, what that shows is that the religious groups did have enough clout to force the political leadership to make some kind of a gesture towards them. So the Ukrainians obviously were too politically insignificant on their own for the President of the United States to pay attention to them. Were there any? Okay.
Thank you. Please make it brief. I'd be happy to take some questions
Yes.
from the floor.
I'd like to respond to the comments Dr. Klid made. I think Duranty is a complex figure. As far as I know, Duranty was manipulated by Stalin with young girls. When he said peasants would not stand up, it seems to me that this is some sort of provocation Stalin was using. Exactly whom Duranty said this, but as far as I can tell about the Far East, he was playing this sort of game in order to woo Japan into the Far East and destroy them. Japan was not interested in falling into that trap. So Duranty's comments may have far significant, far deeper roots in Stalin's strategic thinking. This is one comment. The religion thing, as far as I know, Cordell Hull insisted, Secretary of Department, and because Hull's opposition, FDR tried to get Hull out of the decision making, and without any comment of without any Soviet commitment to freedom of religion, Roosevelt went ahead to open diplomatic relations, and this continued. But that's part of the reason why Stalin sort of promulgated the famous Constitution in 1936, just to placate Americans.
Thank you. Dr. Bolianovskyi?
Maybe I can add something to Bohdan Klid toward, it's my maybe interpretation toward the reasons why Roosevelt was interested to make diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. Maybe we discussed these problems, and maybe I think that one of the reasons among this that you said that was maybe Roosevelt was interested to neutralize the communist influence in America. I mean that maybe in the zone of United States interest. For example, in the same year began some activities, very intensive activities of the communists in Cuba, revolt in Cuba, and Roosevelt was interested to neutralize the maybe activity of communists inside the United States, and maybe it was among other political, economical, geopolitical reasons. It was one of the reasons to make the diplomatic relations, and ignorance of Holodomor in Ukraine, and silence and blind eye on these events. It's firstly. And secondly, towards the Ukrainian organization, that's, of course, I had no time to explain, and that in archive of the United States Department of State, there are a lot of documents, appeals of Ukrainian organization, which pleaded to give a help for starving population in Ukraine. And it was not only American, it was many appeals of Canadian Ukrainian organization, it was European Ukrainian organization from Western Ukraine, and I agree that ignorance of the United States government on these appeals is maybe motivated that United States government, maybe Roosevelt, for Roosevelt, Ukrainian organization as a whole was maybe insufficient and in compared to the relations with the Soviet Union.
Thank you very much. I already, Dr. Tsipko, then Dr. Sissin, and
Yes, my name is Serge Sipko. I'm with the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, and my question is directed to Professor Kuromiya. I was very interested when you mentioned the Ukrainian settlements in the maritime provinces of the Soviet Far East and in Manchuria. And it made me think of Mykola Skripnik, who played a very important role in the extension of Ukrainianization to the Soviet Far East and other parts of the Soviet Union outside of Ukraine. And that Ukrainianization in those areas was discontinued, I believe, from December 1932. But I was wondering if you had seen any references in any of the Japanese documents to or any discussion about the suicide of Mykola Skripnik.
Did I mention in my paper? I think I did. They understood it. Yeah. Yes, very clearly. This is the end of Soviet Ukrainization. That sort of. Yes, there are reports in Japanese documents. Yes.
Thank you, Frank.
Yeah, I want to go back to Bohdan's point about geopolitics, and we've gone through a lot of countries, a lot of places, a lot of reports, and a lot of policies. We don't have Poland in this session, which was so far today, which of course was much more intrinsically related, and for which it was an internal problem as well. And what I'm struck with when we look at it, and when we're going to try and put this together, is I think one of the factors that gets added to it, whatever its relative weakness or strength, is the creation of a Ukrainian diaspora at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, and what role that played or turned out to play during the Holodomor. And we're talking about relative weaknesses and strengths. What I am almost stunned with is the idea that for Japan, where this world was very, very far away, it seemed to be easier to accept that Ukrainians are a people or a nation and might be useful to us than it was for Germany, that was much closer and was not really thinking and still accepting in many ways European attitudes towards Russia as an entity, Russian Empire and whatever. To Japan it was new, but they had these people now on their doorstep, just from the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And I take it the people who were active, the Ivan Svits of this world and the other people we know, seem to have made an impact, but also perhaps because of Japanese conceptualizations of nation, as a ethnocultural body, that it was rather easy then to accept that, well, if Ukrainians are such, then they are a nation and they may be useful. And in a certain way, perhaps the path was already broken by the Poles, the old Polish policy of Pilsudski. Let's find a way for Japan to intervene and attack from the other side, right? So that in a way the Ukrainians had a path that had been put forth for them. Then, I mean, we'll hear tomorrow about Canada. Canada was not going to make a major policy, but of course, the appearance of all these people in the Western Prairies suddenly made it an issue of the day. Then a comment on the U.S. issue and Roosevelt. I think, I mean, you will have the documentation to see, but as far as I can understand from the Ukrainian community, which organized reasonably well during World War I and was able to run at least certain influences in the U.S. right after the war in 1918-19. The great divides we talked about, that is the rise of the Ukrainian communist movement in the U.S., so important in cities, divided the community well and in a difficult way. And then the divide between the church and the secular authorities. In the United States, Bishop Bohdan decided to move the church away from politics. He had exactly the opposite policy to Sheptytsky, so in the one case, the Ukrainian Catholic Church is very active in Western Ukraine, and in which the famine and the famine issue becomes a way the church is struggling against the communists and goes on. In the U.S., the church went in the other way. So that also, I think, weakened the possible influences on it. So these are just more general comments from what you do. But I think when we're going to try and put this together in some way, these ideas of these contending foreign policies and needs, interventions and non-interventions, and then the roles to which these various Ukrainian diasporas, we'll be hearing more about Prague and the other diaspora as a way, maybe a way when we're trying to map this out, maybe a useful way to look at it. So just some comments.
Thank you, Frank. Dr. Fonzi, please. Your question.
Thank you. So my first question is for Professor Kuromiya. In the British and the German, the Polish and Italian case, I've seen that there was a lot of exchange of information between diplomats of different nations in the Soviet Union. And the major source were the Germans, actually. Otto Schiller provided a lot of memoranda and information to all other diplomats in the country. So was that also in the Japanese case the case? So was the same thing? And then just a second comment rather than question. Actually, so we see that in many countries, so we've seen in these panels that so reactions to the famine in many countries, and actually many observe that we know, or so we cannot achieve a better knowledge of the Holodomor itself by looking at foreign sources. But actually, what we can do, and I think it would be interesting to do more, so would be to kind of internationalize or transnationalize the history of the famine by looking first at reaction and perceptions in other countries. They're related also to how in a country the Soviet Union was seen in those years. No? I worked, so for example, on the German and Italian perceptions of the Soviet Union in the 30s, the modernization, how modernization was seen and perceived in Italy and Germany. And the second thing would be the research on the international ethnic networks that's connected. So, for example, the Mennonite community and the ethnic German community, the Ukrainian communities abroad, in order to make a sort of transnational history and to see how famine actually helped construct actually these ethnic networks and reinforce also these ethnic networks.
Okay, I think the second is more comment, so I'm not going to answer. There's no clear answer to that. As far as the information sharing in Moscow and elsewhere, even though Japan and Germany concluded this famous anti-Comintern pact at the end of 1936, the relations between Japan and Germany weren't very good because Germany was supporting Kuomintang in China, with military forces, military equipment, and so on. So the relations weren't good. Britain or British and Japanese, American interests in China were colliding. So Britain, US, no, Poland. Poland didn't have any great stakes in China, and for Poland and for Japan, the Soviet Union was the enemy. So they had very close diplomatic and intelligence relations. My Polish colleague and I even wrote a book about it. It's only available in Polish, but Germany, it's surprising. Germany didn't trust Japan. Japan didn't trust Germany until late, until after Hitler. I mean, Hitler was very impressed by Japan's withdrawal from the League of Nations, and Hitler followed it, yeah. But until 1937, German military advisors were helping Kuomintang fight against the Japanese. Only in late 1937 or 38, Hitler said no, so they were withdrawn. But so gathering of information between Japanese and Germany, between Japan and Germany, was quite limited. I haven't seen much.
Thank you. I'm afraid I can take only one last question from the floor, and Dr. Olga Bertelsen indicated that she is ready to ask us.
Actually, it's not a question. It's an addition to Dr. Sisson's comment about the reasons for why Roosevelt decided to recognize the Soviet Union in 1933. We tend to overlook the intelligent aspect of the story because Roosevelt's secretary, Harry Hopkins, according to most recent studies, was a spy, and he influenced the decision of Roosevelt because of that. So we can argue it's a debatable question, but at the same time he played a significant role in many, many decisions that Roosevelt made in terms of war and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olga. And I'm also tempted to ask one question, if I may. 1 minute left. So, judging from the documents you explored, is it obvious that Ukrainians were recognized or not recognized as a separate nation in the same way as Lithuanians or Latvians or other peoples included in the Soviet Union?
In Japan?
Yes.
Frank also asked similar questions. I think so. There is one interesting episode. A couple of years ago, my friend from Kravchenko Center found a film produced by a Ukrainian director, which they thought was lost forever. Where did he find it? A negative copy in Tokyo, because it was listed Ukrainian film. And it was reproduced and sent back to Ukraine a year or so ago. So, yes, as far as I could tell, already in 1905, 1905, at the time of the Russo-Japanese War, Ukrainian socialist revolutionaries were invited as a potential forces against Russia. So Poles, Finns, and so on.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your insightful presentations. Thank you very much, Dr. Klid. Thank you for being here, and stay with us, please. This is coffee break.
Interesting, thank you. Yeah, if you
Thank you for this presentation and kind invitation. And I am especially grateful to Miroslav Jurkiewicz for translation of my paper. It's actually not mine paper. It is in cooperation with Miroslav Czech, who is co-author of this paper. And when I will be using we, it is not pluralis majestaticus or specific scholar manner. It is just we, that means Ola Hnatyuk and Miroslav Čech. And I have to use my glasses, otherwise I can't see. The title is as follows: Ukrainian reactions to the Holodomor of 1932-1933 in interwar Europe, new discoveries and sources. And our presentation is problematic in character, bringing together two aspects: a summary of research to date and identification of a problem, both of which, in our opinion, require extensive study. The basic lacuna that we indicate is the lack of the studies devoted both to the Ukrainian relief effort and the part of community, political and church organizations, and to similar international efforts undertaken by religious and community organizations of various countries, religious denominations and nations. In this paper, we focus attention on the European dimension, although we realized that actions on the American continent were of considerable importance and have been much better studied. Study of the so-called relief effort must take account of the broader international context and the politics of the countries in which it was organized. This means putting the subject of the Holodomor in the context of European politics in the early 30s on the agenda. This subject is an integral and important component of the Ukrainian question in European politics of the interwar period. As has been shown by documents published thanks to the archival revolution of the 19th and 2000s, Stalin was guided by exceptionally ideological notions of inevitable conflict among capitalist states. Hence, the contradictory nature of his policy between 1932 and 1934. On the one hand, he relied on the system of collective security and struggle against fascism, symbolized by the diplomacy of Maxim Litvinov, Commissar of Foreign Affairs from 1930 to 1939, which was, however, a tactical move. On the other hand, in strategic terms, he sought to divide the world and set on one state against another. He made the basic elements of domestic policy dependent on the strategic aims of the USSR in the international arena, as was particularly apparent in this first half of 30s. An analysis of the international political context of the Holodomor makes it possible to take a new look at the reasons for its occurrence, as well as to indicate the factors conducive to the culmination of its most tragic phase in the summer of 1933. It is also important to take note of assistance to various ethnic and religious groups of the Soviet population. The paper is divided to two parts, and the first part is international context, and the second is Ukrainian and international relief effort. So the international context, first, the Soviet front on the Prosna and Varta. Prosna and Varta are rivers on the border, were the rivers on the border between Poland and Germany. Between 1932 and 1934, the political situation in East Central Europe was very dynamic. It is obvious. This was associated with the crisis of Versailles system, further worsened by the world economic crisis, the Great Depression. Two states, Germany and Poland were particularly important to the development of the domestic and foreign political situation in Europe. Germany's importance derived from its economic potential, which Europe needed to exploit if it was to overcome the crisis and develop normally. Poland's importance lay in its geopolitical role as a stabilizing factor in European politics generally, and in particular in the alliances of France, the chief guardian of the Versailles system. The Franco-Polish alliance was meant to prevent a potential German threat and restrain the USSR. In the Weimar Republic, the program of boundary revision, especially of the Polish corridor, was an element of general political consensus. The Rapallo political line provided for revision of the system established by the Paris Peace Conference and the satisfaction of German interests. In German foreign policy, the Rapallo line remained relevant even after Hitler's accession to power, until the beginning of 1934. At that time, a declaration of non-aggression was signed by Germany and Poland, which entailed revision of the system of European interstate alliances in general, and in particular, the culmination of the Rapallo line in German-Soviet relations. From the German viewpoint, the declaration was to bring about an alliance with Poland. It is worth noting that Hitler officially recognized those Warsaw interests in Soviet Ukraine until March 1939. For Stalin, the signing of the German-Polish declaration came as a surprise, all the more because since 1932, a policy of maximum rapprochement with Poland had been followed on his orders. On April 1, 1932, by resolution of the Politburo, the Bureau of International Information, headed by, mentioned today, Karl Radek, the Bureau was endowed with broad authority in foreign policy. It received all available information about the international situation from government structures and special services, had the right to contact foreign politicians and dispatch its own agents, and reported directly to Stalin. From mid-1932 to early 1934, the Bureau concentrated on political and military strategic problems of mutual relations in the Moscow-Warsaw-Berlin triangle. Of course, various scenarios and political development were considered, given that in parallel with Stalin's signing of a non-aggression pact with Poland in July 1932. He confirmed a plan for war with Poland presented to him by Mikhail Tukhachevsky at the beginning of 1932. The strategy of waging war was revised accordingly. The Red Army was to be prepared for rapid offensive operations far beyond enemy lines. And on the Western Front, the main adversary was Poland, which was to be destroyed. At the end of 1932, Tukhachevsky declared to Stalin that he was ready to carry this out. The specter of war truly seemed to be hovering over Europe at the time, as shown by the deterioration of the political situation in Germany and the de facto agreement between France and Britain to revise the borders of Germany and Italy. Given this unfavorable international configuration, in April 1932, Józef Piłsudski also adopted a peace-loving policy with regard to the USSR, entrusting its implementation to two close collaborators, Ignacy Matuszewski and mentioned today Bogusław Miedziński. Owing to this rapprochement with the USSR, Piłsudski felt sufficiently safe in the East not to refute information about Poland's preparation for a preventive war against Germany that was widely disseminated in the world press, especially in Germany. In actual fact, Piłsudski was not planning any war at all. Moscow, for its part, decided to profit by harping on the subject of preventive war. In March 1933, a representative of the Kremlin proposed that the Polish leadership make an anti-German alliance with France, and in the event of a German-Polish war, receive weapons and material from the USSR. And this is the quote, today the front of the Soviet Union runs along the Prosna and Warta, that is the rivers that constituted the Polish-German boundary at the time. In reply, the official Gazeta Polska declared Poland's readiness to cooperate with USSR and the countries of Little Entente. The price of potential Soviet-Polish alliance was also understandable. Poland would refrain from showing any interest in internal matter of the USSR. Toward the end of May 1933, Radek warned that any Polish activity on the territory of the Ukrainian SSR would be quotation, described by us as conscious or unconscious executions of German plans in the East. The end of quotation. The warning was heard in Warsaw. Poland didn't come out in defense of starving Ukrainians or even of its own compatriots, even though Polish diplomacy correctly apprised the dimensions of the catastrophic famine and accurately identified Stalin's desire to make use of it in order to put an end to the Ukrainian national movement. The front and security behind the lines. The mention of a Soviet front on the Prosna and Warta should be understood as a version of a long-held Bolshevik plan for the destruction of the Polish state. The role of Ukraine in this plan, from the military viewpoint, was to serve as a deep and especially reliable rear area of the USSR, so that in the event of Soviet fraternal assistance to Polish people, the Poles wouldn't be able to count on Ukrainian uprising. Understanding the political and military strategy of USSR in 1932-1934 makes it possible to take a new look at Stalin's goals in programming the Great Famine. He well remembered the experience of 1919-1922 when powerful peasant uprising forced Lenin to make concession to the Ukrainians. At the beginning of 1930, Bolshevik fears of Ukrainian uprising forced Stalin to publish the article "Головокружение от успехов," Designs with Success in Pravda on March 2, and suspend accelerated collectivization in the Ukrainian SSR for more than half a year. Similar fears underlie Stalin's directive of August 11 1932 to the Politburo, which initiated the Holodomor. Quotation, set ourselves the goal of turning Ukraine into a fortress of the USSR, a real modern republic, within the shortest possible time. Do not spare money for this purpose. End of quotation. He maintained, if we don't correct the situation in Ukraine immediately, we could lose Ukraine. It is also quotation. And the next part of quotation. Bear in mind that Pilsudski is not drowsing. Pilsudski nie drzemniet. And his network of agents in Ukraine is many times stronger than Redens and Kosor think. Also keep in mind that within the Communist Party of Ukraine, which is 500,000 members, there is no lack of rotten elements, active and latent petrolids and direct agents of Pilsudski. As soon as the situation gets worse, these elements will not hesitate to open a front within and outside the party, against the party. End of quotation by Stalin. In 1932-33, compared with the period of forced collectivization, Moscow's position in the international arena was considerably stronger. Through the grandiose plans for rearmament of the Red Army had been realized only in part, but the armed forces in the USSR had still become the strongest in Europe. In its relations with Germany, the USSR maintained the Rapallo line, simultaneously developing friendly relations with Poland and France. Consequently, no one thought of intervening in Soviet internal affairs. Moscow managed to attract the United States with the prospect of economic cooperation, also possibly with the prospect of partnership against Japan. On the other hand, for large circles of left and liberal public opinion, Red Moscow was the only hope of stopping Hitler. The USSR could now propose terms more favorable to its interest to other states. And the second part of this presentation is international assistance in the political game. And sub-part is Soviet flirtation with Nazi Germany. Not filtration, but flirtation. The preceding survey of the political situation in the Soviet-Polish-German triangle was required as preparation for a clearer exposition of our thesis on the reaction of Ukrainians outside the USSR to the Holodomor and the place of the relief campaign in that reaction. Poland was regarded by the USSR, Germany and other states as the country with the greatest interest in the Ukrainian question. But Poland remained silent about the Holodomor, which was one of the aims of Kremlin policy with regards to Warsaw. To cite Stalin's words, there was no one to defend the rotten elements, the conscious and unconscious Petlurites. For Pilsudski himself was the first to refrain from that. The situation was initially different in Germany, where the Holodomor was discussed openly, although concern was expressed first and foremost for starving ethnic Germans. In research on the Holodomor, there is no greater taboo subject than the silence of the West, or even denial of the death of millions by starvation. The reason was fear of the consequences of Hitler's accession to power and his inhuman ideology. But Stalin himself didn't fear Hitler's coming to power. Until the mid-1934, he didn't regard the Führer as an independent politician and considered the Nazi regime as a temporary phenomenon. He therefore did all he could to continue the Rapallo line, even in concert with Hitler. Inhuman ideology was no obstacle to Stalin. Then or later in 1939, he regarded the socialists, particularly the Second International, as much more serious enemies than Hitler. And the Kremlin began to change this attitude only in mid-1934. In June and early July 1933, mass actions were conducted in Germany to support starving compatriots in the USSR, and an exhibition of hunger letters and photographic materials was organized. The official Soviet representative in Germany responded with a protest. I pointed out to Neurath, it was a German foreign minister, the weighty consequences to which that campaign will lead if he does not manage to prevent it. The protest yielded instant results. 2 days later, Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Education and Propaganda, issued a directive emphasizing that the government request that accounts from Soviet Russia be concluded, as the publication have already achieved the desired effect. End of quotation. And the directive was carried out in Germany in the course of the next year. At the same time, Germany and the USSR agreed that assistance from German community and religious organizations would be supplied to the German population of the USSR through the network of Torksin stores. The Soviets made every effort to interfere with this action, but owing to the initiative of individuals and organizations, assistance to Germans was provided on a large scale. Some 40 to 60% of the German minority benefited from assistance, which continued until May 1934. In the following year, it was forbidden completely. Mass repressive measures were undertaken against the German minority, and tens of thousands of Germans were deported from the Ukrainian SSR to Kazakhstan. The USSR permitted assistance to the starving populations on the basis of the like-to-like principle, that is, one's own were to help one's own. Germans from Germany helped Germans in the USSR, minorities throughout the world helped minorities, Quakers helped Quakers, Jews helped Jews, Russians helped Russians, and Ukrainians helped Ukrainians. Stalin exploited this form of assistance as an element of interstate relations with states in which assistance committees were active. It became a pretext for subsequent repressive measures against national groups once the Kremlin declared that assistance itself constituted evidence of counter-revolutionary and espionage activity of a given national group. Kremlin policy on the current international situation contributed to formulating assistance as humanitarian activity on the model of help provided to the starving during the famine of 1921-22. It was Ukrainians outside the USSR who undertook this initiative. In Lviv, the Ukrainian Civic Committee to Save Ukraine was established on July 24, 1933, and became the coordinating body for Ukrainian committees in various countries. Ukrainian parliamentary deputies in Romania who worked closely with Galicians showed considerable activity. The Ukrainian Socialist Radical Party and the Ukrainian Social Democratic Party formed their own committee in Poland. The Petlurist Ukrainian Central Committee in Warsaw and its branches throughout Poland set themselves apart at the demand of the Polish authorities, but the Association of Ukrainian Emigrants in Paris cooperated with the Lviv Committee, as did the European Association of Ukrainian Organizations Abroad, established in 1931 by the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. On the international level, the Interdenomination and Interethnic Committee to Help the Starving in the USSR, initiated by Cardinal Theodor Initzer of Vienna in August 1933 at the behest of Metropolitan Andrii Sheptytsky, attempted to coordinate the relief action. But the International Red Cross, which had provided a great deal of assistance in 1921-22, offered none this time, although its leadership was requested to do so by the Council of the League of Nations. The request was issued as a result of a discussion of a famine in the USSR, particularly in Ukraine, by the Council on September 27, 1933. Moscow didn't agree to the provision of assistance because Soviet diplomats insisted there was no famine in the USSR. Moscow could behave so because no member state of the League initiated consideration of the matter. It was put forward only by Ukrainian parliamentarians from Poland and Romania, as well as international and Ukrainian organizations cooperating with them. Ukrainian relief effort in European countries. Volodymyr Kisilevsky diary for the years 1931-39 may be regarded as something of a guidebook to the Ukrainian question in the European politics of the 30s, informing the world about the Holodomor and the relief effort. At that time, Kisilevsky was director of the Ukrainian Press Bureau in London. This bureau worked with particular urgency during the Holodomor, informing the Western public opinion and politicians and doing all it could to support international and relief efforts to help the starving. The activity of Ukrainian Press Bureau will be the subject of an address to be given by our colleague Roman Wysocki. Kisilevsky visited Vienna at the turn of the years 1933-34 after the conference of Cardinal Initzer Committee on the mid of December, and there he met with the Cardinal, his deputy Ewald Amende, General Secretary of the International Congress of National Minorities, and author of a book on the Holodomor illustrated with photographs by Alexander Wienerberger, and with Myron Hornykiewicz, Secretary of the Committee and Parish Priest in Vienna. He discussed avenues of cooperation with them and spoke separately with another member of the committee, the chief rabbi of Vienna, Dr. David Feuchtwang, about involving Jewish organizations in Austria and Britain in the relief effort. The rabbi, Kisilevsky wrote, received me with extraordinary friendliness. We spoke at first about matters of the relief efforts, then went on to political subjects. With regards to relief efforts, he asked me to direct the attention of the London Jewish organizations to need for getting in touch with similar organizations in Vienna. The unique aspect of the relief effort of 1933-1934 was the successful coordination of the activity of Ukrainian, German, Jewish and Russian emigre organizations in providing humanitarian assistance to the starving in the USSR This despite pressure from the Soviets and European governments under their influence, as well as left and liberal public opinion. Such cooperation required a common ethical, intellectual, and political denominator. On the Ukrainian side, it was formulated by Olgierd Ippolit Boczkowski, a Ukrainian sociologist, political and community activist living in Prague. He was a social democrat and a member of foreign delegation of Ukrainian Social Democratic Labour Party, which belonged to the Second International. In 1943-1944, Boczkowski published 2 open letters to Edward Herriot and an essay titled Spineless Europe. In the following year, the Lviv newspaper Dilo carried his article The Moral Inflation of Our Age, in which he generalized the moral lesson of the Holodomor for European civilization, pointing out its universal character. In January 1934, Boczkowski wrote Famine in Ukraine for the use of Ukrainian press bureau. Significant for us are the conclusions that Boczkowski wanted to set before Western public opinion. This is a long quotation. The word, he asserted after a thorough enumeration of publications about the Holodomor in the world press, was not badly informed about the catastrophic famine in the land of Soviets. It is another matter that it didn't react actively to this disaster. It didn't give actual assistance to the population dying en masse on that side of the Soviet border. Boczkowski named the key problem facing the old continent at the time of the Holodomor. Quotation: previously, Europe would react to what happened and how. Now, it is mainly interested in where something happened and to whom. Depending on that, it either remains silent or reacts. A crime ceases to be a crime, a wrong, oppression, violence, depending whether they occurred, for example, in Moscow or Berlin, on this or that side of the Soviet border. Boczkowski reacted with particular indignation to Edward Herriot's contention that the campaign with the invented famine in Ukraine came from Berlin. Quotation: this is unheard of and unexampled slander. This is a slap in the face to hundreds of thousands of victims of this year's famine in Ukraine. This is an insult never justified in any way to the tragic condition of national misfortune in Soviet Ukraine. End of quotation. And other Boczkowski article, Famine in Ukraine, the task of this publication is to cast light in general on the catastrophic famine in the Ukrainian lands under the Soviets in 1933 and to draw attention to the circumstance that it isn't accidental, but that the famine will definitely be repeated in 1934. The end of quotation. This observation is important as part of an answer to the question about the true meaning of a relief action for inhabitants of the USSR. What is paramount is that assistance actually reached part of Soviet population, including people of various nationalities and denomination. We do not know to what extent the efforts to inform the world about the famine and the relief effort, in particular Ukrainian international and interdenominational, helped put a stop to the Holodomor in the summer of 1933. However, we do know that the fact of the death of millions became too obvious. We also know that the regime needed enough farmers to sow the grain in 1933, and therefore Stalin began to wind down the famine in spring 1933. Stalin's invitation to Edward Herriot to visit the USSR, he was there from August 26 to September 1933, was partially Moscow's reaction to the voices of Ukrainians outside the USSR raised in protest. The pastoral letter of the hierarchy of the Greek Catholic Church, titled Ukrainian in its death agony, the formation of relief committees, and the efforts to inform the international community. Earlier, Stalin had felt to need to organize such Potyomkin spectacles. There were more general reasons for this invitation: to improve Soviet-French relationship. Both sides were interested in this. That's why Herriot helped Stalin to cover up the famine. For an appropriate presentation of the reaction of Ukrainians outside the USSR to the Holodomor, it is important to note that in parallel with the action concerning the famine in Soviet Ukraine, preparations were being made for the convocation of an all-Ukrainian National Congress. It was intended to unite and consolidate all Ukrainian national forces and political groupings in order to create an all-national representation in the international arena. And now domestic Ukrainian factors in the relief efforts. Bochkovsky noted the significance of the suicide of Mykola Khvilievy and suicide of Mykola Skripnik for the initiation of the Ukrainian relief effort. Similar views were expressed by Milena Rudnicka. It is important to emphasize this, for the reaction of Ukrainians outside the USSR was conditioned not only by the international political situation but also by domestic Ukrainian factors. For the Soviets, the reaction of Ukrainians throughout the world to the Holodomor presented a serious challenge. Accordingly, Moscow had recourse to a variety of measures to suppress it, especially pressure on Poland to forbid the activity of relief committees. In 2016, the Foreign Intelligence Service of Ukraine granted public access to the archives of Soviet special services, especially the Civilian Intelligence Service of the GPU in the years of 1925-1942, confirming that for the Moscow leadership of the Ukrainian question was particularly important and was considered politically integral, with no separation of the Ukrainian SSSR from Western Ukraine and the political emigration. Soviet intelligence sought to penetrate all Ukrainian political groupings, obtain confidential information, and neutralize those of their actions that the Kremlin considered dangerous to itself. The Soviets took a particular interest in contacts of Ukrainian political parties and groupings with foreign governments, special services and armies, and naturally Moscow sought by every measure with the assistance of its Kharkiv and from 1934 Kiev subordinates to prevent the unification of the Ukrainian political community outside the USSR. The culmination of efforts by Ukrainians abroad to inform the world was to be the day of mourning planned for October 29, 1933. A week before that date, however, Mykola Lemik shot an official of the Soviet consulate in Lviv, Alexei Mailov, and the Polish authorities availed themselves of that pretext to forbid mass activity on squares and streets throughout Galicia. A similar prohibition had been issued earlier by Romania. But that was not enough for Moscow, for in July and August it had already directed Warsaw's attention to the activity of anti-Soviet forces in Galicia. In mid-November, in conversation with the Polish Foreign Minister Józef Beck, the Soviet plenary representative Volodymyr Antonov-Ovsienko declared, quotation, "In Little Poland there are several dozen and perhaps even more organizations of district committees alone. Those organizations arose in the process of the anti-Soviet campaign, and I do not understand how one can combat the anti-Soviet campaign without destroying the very organizations that are leading and organizing that campaign," the end of quotation. The issue of prohibiting the activity of committees to aid the starving didn't die down until early 1934. Moscow interpreted the absence of such a ban as an attempt by the Polish authorities, quotation, to support and inflame anti-Soviet and even interventionist attitudes in Western Ukraine for any eventuality. An element of pressure on Poland was preparation for the public trial of the so-called Ukrainian military organization UVO that supposedly existed in the USSR. The trial of the Ukrainian military organization was meant to be an exact copy of the trial of SVU organization for the liberation of Ukraine of 1930. That is, a settling of accounts with the Petorists. The trial of UVO was meant to provide cover for the extermination of Galicians in the Ukrainian SSR and encourage the Poles to root out the Ukrainian movement in Galicia. It was also a means of discrediting the relief effort and intimidating Ukrainians who received assistance from abroad. In the autumn of 1933, a new motive was added to the trial of UVO, the complete destruction of Ukrainian national communism as personified by Mykola Skripnik. By the same token, this would be the destruction of the remains of Ukrainian autonomy in the USSR. The process of destruction culminated with the joint plenum, which took place in mid-November 1933. It is important to note that initially the defendants in the trial of UVO were accused of belonging to a new network of Polish agents. In the autumn, when German-Polish negotiations on the signing of a non-aggression pact entered their final stage, the charge against the defendants were changed to membership in a Polish-German network. This confirms that yet again that the successive waves of repression against the Ukrainian national movement in the 30s must be studied in relation to goals pursued by Stalin in the international arena at a given moment and the current status of the Ukrainian question in European politics. And conclusion and postulates. We have presented the subject articulated in the title only in point form. However, it was really long. Such were the views and conclusions that arose in the course of our work on successive volumes of publications of series Ukrainian Europe 1921 and 1939. The discovery of a certain quantity of sources hitherto unused by historians reveals the tremendous potential of archival collections outside Russia and Poland for the study of the Holodomor and its international dimension. First, it is necessary to restore the memory of those who provided assistance, not only to give due recognition to those who showed humanity at a difficult time and preserve their memory. The point is also that relief efforts offered a practical alternative to the politics of the day, with their imperialism and totalitarian ideologies ideologies covered up by clamorous slogans about social progress and universal class or racial happiness. Secondly, it has to be shown that remaining silent or even denying the catastrophic famine of the Ukrainian people was the policy of European states, regardless of their prevailing social order. Democratic, authoritarian, and totalitarian countries alike kept silent about the genocide of Ukrainians. They did so for a variety of reasons, but maintaining good relations with the Soviets was always the motive. Third, study of the international context of the Holodomor gives eloquent proof that by 1932-34, Stalin and not only Hitler was the principal creator of European politics. Ukraine occupied the key position in Stalin's political and military strategy. Hence, his program, adopted in mid-1932, of turning it into a fortress and a model Soviet republic, one element of which was to starve millions of Ukrainians to death and annihilate party and government cadres. Fourth, the question of shared responsibility of Western states for the Holodomor takes its place on the agenda, a question raised as long ago as 1958 by Milena Rudnicka as a student of Holodomor. Fifth, the Ukrainian question must be included in full measure in the history of interwar Europe, for that it is the only way to gain an understanding not only of the tragedy of Holodomor. The configuration of international politics in 1930-34 is strongly reminiscent of the situation in 1939 when Stalin invited Hitler to renew the Rapallo line. The configuration of European politics depended on Poland, and everyone attempted to use Ukraine as a bargaining chip for its place in Hitler's strategy, determined the direction of his expansion to strike east or west. In order to give well-founded answers to these questions, it is necessary to study archival collections, first and foremost those of 8 committees and individuals, organizations that provided assistance to residents of the USSR for the study of the international context of the Holodomor and its place in European politics. Particularly valuable sources are German, Polish, Austrian, British, French, Italian, American, Canadian, and Romanian archives, as well as the archives of international organizations, especially the League of Nations and the International Congress of National Minorities, the Vatican archives, the archives of the Second International, and the editorial offices of newspapers that wrote most about the famine. Especially important from our point of view are the archival collections of particular individuals: Cardinal Theodor Innitzer, Ewald Amende, Alexander Wienerberger, Johann Mowinckel, Edward Rieu, Robert Seton Watson, Sir Louis Naimier, Mary Shipshanks, Rhys Davies, and the British politicians and scholars who belonged to the Anglo-Ukrainian Society. Studies of the Holodomor have concentrated mainly on such questions as revealing its scope and geography, as well as the organization of the repressive system built by the Kremlin to suppress Ukraine by means of famine. The national aspect of the catastrophic famine has been studied, creating a strong basis for classifying the Holodomor as a genocide of the Ukrainian people. The time has now come to study world reaction to the death by starvation of millions of Ukrainians and other peoples inhabiting the USSR, as well as to describe the relief efforts. It is also time to analyze the place of Holodomor in European politics of the 30s, which can already be called extraordinarily important. This is also relevant to the evolution of present-day European and war politics. Those who want a return to the 30s are growing in strength. The international context of the Holodomor stands eloquent witness to the tragically high price paid by Europe and the world for renouncing values in politics, for the moral inflation of their age. Thank you for your patience and attention.
We open the floor to comments and questions. I think there's a microphone here.
Of course.
Might add, since I have this minute, the Bochkovsky volumes and the Shumsky volumes, the first ones to appear.
Can you use the microphone, please? Behind you.
Yeah. Before you come up with the question, I just wanted to point out that the Bochkovsky volumes and the Shumsky volumes are available from CIUS Press. We hope soon to get all of the volumes, and so that if you would like to obtain them, please go on our website and order them from the press. And now I open for questions and comments. Yes, please.
Well, I just want to thank the speaker, first of all, for doing this research. I mean, this campaign, the coordinated campaign that was initiated in the summer of 1933 is so tremendously important. And I think we tend to underestimate the strength of that campaign. I also sort of independently thought the same thing that you did, that I wonder if that campaign didn't, in a sense, prevent further deaths in Ukraine. But the most amazing thing, I mean, there have been a couple of really huge campaigns in the history of the Ukrainian movement. And this one ranks right there. I mean, they managed to coordinate between Ukrainian social democrats, anybody who wasn't sort of pro-Soviet, to ON on the other side, to the Skoropadsky movement. I mean, there were people like Sofia Rusova, who was, you know, an old-time, you know, intelligent from the 19th century, an activist taking part in this. I mean, they appealed to all sorts of organizations, and I think the scope of that campaign has never been really fully talked about. So that's just all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you. It is really worth to mention that it was, in other cases, it was impossible to cooperate with such different organizations like Jewish organization, Jewish and German, at the same place at the mid of 30s, 1933. In other cases, they were incompatible, but in this case, it works.
Thank you very much, you and Miroslav. Thank you very much for an extraordinary paper. My question is, as admirable as that relief effort was, why did it take so long to form? I mean, the Holodomor had been going on for 3/4 of a year or a year. Is it that people hadn't realized what was going on? Is it that it took so long for people to get everybody to agree to come aboard, or if you know, what was the explanation for why it took so long?
Why it was so late? I mean, in the summer of 1933, First of all, I think that there wasn't enough information. But of course, this signal, this alarm was suicide committed by Holodomor and then by Skripnik, and it was an obvious sign that it is a disaster. Before it wasn't an effort enough to be enough load to inform the public opinion, even Ukrainian public opinion in Galicia. So of course we can find other reasons, but the lack of information and this alarm, which was this two very loud suicides, very loud shot.
Maybe I'll just add, and disbelief, the myth of the abundant Ukraine, I think was very hard to overcome. I talked to people who were remembered yet in the Carpathians when they tried to begin the relief effort for Velika Ukraina, for Great Ukraine, and one of them saying that we couldn't believe that, you know, in our mountains you had famine. How could they have famine there? I think I'm part of, and I think at least for North America, of course, the strength of the communist organizations has in the community and played a major role in halting it, at least. Not fully, do we? All right, if we do not, we've had a long day for many of us, I know. We have been privileged to hear many, many good papers, but I think we can be particularly honored that we had such a wonderful wrap-up to putting it in a broader context. And this project of Ukraine and Europe 1921 to 1939, I think, is one of the major projects now beginning. As we are finishing the Rushevsky project, we think of new projects that we would like to see done. This is a tremendous project they have undertaken. From the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, we will try to give the help we can give, but I encourage other community scholarly organizations to help them on it. They are great enthusiasts who have really undertaken what, if the Academy of Sciences worked in ways we'd like it to work, if there were academic funding institutions in Ukraine funding the kind of projects. Ukraine and Europe and in this period is exactly the kind of project that's needed. We don't see them coming soon, so it's great that it's begun, and now I think we all have to collectively help them and moving them forward. And we thank both our phantom Miroslav Czech of this evening, and Olha, and Roman Vysotsky, who also works with them, who will be speaking tomorrow, and wish them every success with the development of the project.
I would like to add that I have a dream. I have a dream to create a network of scholars who are working on basing their research on this period. So I have a dream.
All right, we join you in the dream. Thank you very much. Yes, there is a reception following. Yes.
Is there a reception? Could you be here?
No, next week.
Okay, so I can mute stuff there.
You can definitely use that.
Thank you.